Amiga's legacy is a bottomless well full of various, often unusual games. Better and worse, all interesting however. So, let's check today's 10 out and hope that they're of the former kind. Alien Target is a rather obscure Polish sci-fi action arcade release and one of the better games from the country to come out so late in Amiga's life. It is also a side-scrolling first-person shoot-'em-up in vein of titles like Operation Wolf or Cabal, leaning towards the wolf more as your character is not visible on the screen. A scientist, Professor Jack L. Cholker, invented a time machine, which as most time machines do, allowed for traveling to both future and past. Unfortunately, in one of the early travels, he unknowingly brought something back, namely aggressive aliens who by then learned where the Earth was. And let me tell you, it took them a short minute to conquer the planet. That's how unprepared we were. At that point, when all of the planet's military failed, the only possible solution for our blue marble to survive, the only way to save it against overwhelming and technically more advanced force, was to resort to employing help of the alien hunters. Hunters such as yourself, my brave, tough, and more dangerous than Riddick viewer. It's not gonna be a walk in the park though, as the aliens stole the time machine and now appropriate it to conquer us in all times, making sure that we're not gonna be able to escape their strong and slimy grasp. They made one crucial mistake though. They underestimated you, and that was what will ultimately bring their demise. So, using this similar time machine, you'll be hunting them in ancient times, in the 19th century, in the present and future too. 4 stages, each placed in a different time and setting. The new enemy appears on the screen every few seconds and his location is always indicated on your scanner, and you have to direct yourself to it scrolling in the appropriate direction, making sure to dispose of it and any others before you run out of energy. Keeping tabs on all of them so that they wouldn't overwhelm you. And since we're on the subject, you can replenish the energy, ammo and your grenades by shooting tokens containing set power-ups. Naturally, Alien Target is neither most ambitious nor the best shoot-'em-up out there, but it's decent enough to provide some fun and a lot of action. And if you enjoy these crosshair mouse controlled games, you're gonna like it. Blobz is part lemmings, part worms, and part something entirely different. And I can't put my finger what that something else is. At least not yet. Simply put, it's a puzzle game where you have to lead a group of blobs to safety while avoiding any and all dangers by using a set of different commands that can be issued to them. All within a time limit, obviously. Blobs, so those tiny round green and squishy balls with floating eyes, behave identically to lemmings, so they will just happily go forwards if not directed otherwise, even if it will mean them going straight towards the eternal sleep. To put it nicely, at the bottom of the screen, same as in Lemmings, there's a set of buttons, each corresponding to a particular skill that you can assign to each and every little blob. And they're quite varied too, from jump through dig to a shot that destroys obstacles in our creature's way, kinda like a bazooka shot in Worms. Additionally, not all levels are straightforward start to exit first, and some of them have objectives, like the requirement to collect a number of items on your way or destroying specific installations. Even more so, not all skills are available initially, and some must be picked up throughout the level to be able to use them later on. I think saying that Blobz is same but different to Lemmings is the best way to describe the game, even if it often feels much faster than the Lemmings are. The developer of Crystal Dragon Magnetic Fields by 1994 had quite a few games in their portfolio. I mean, titles like Lotus Turbo Challenge Trilogy, Supercars 1 and 2 were pretty well known and respected. And yet, much different than Crystal Dragon. That is a first-person dungeon-crawling RPG heavily inspired by the legendary classic Dungeon Master. Story-wise, you play as a duo of adventurers who set off to find and defeat the evil wizard that erected a fortress around the titular Crystal. Crystal, which power he's trying to harness to rule the world. Whatever you want to say about the Gandalf wannabe, he is ambitious. Now, it's perhaps not the most novel or captivating story out there, but it's good enough as a basis for a dungeon crawler. So once again, you move in steps, each covering one square on a built-in auto-map and turned by 90 degrees only. It's perhaps an older and less atmospheric approach to the genre, especially by 1994, but it's one that was relatively easy for the Amiga to still handle comfortably. The game allows you to compose your duo of adventurers out of a typical for the genre classes of warrior, paladin, thief, assassin, cleric and magician. And while all combinations are feasible, if you're careful methodical in how you play, not all are equally as effective and not all progress at the same pace. So, while some may feel weaker initially, it doesn't mean that they're not gonna be stronger than others later. They may just require more attention, care, and a lot more saves coming. For a fairly balanced first playthrough, however, I'd recommend going with tried and tested armored brawler with a caster pairing. They may not be the most versatile or even the strongest at the end game choice, but they're the most rounded up pick for the beginning, and a classic that should allow you going through the whole story start to finish without issue. The game is composed out of 23 dungeons, some of which are split into smaller ones, for a total of 63 levels to crawl through, and dozens upon dozens of various unique bodies to beat. Those fights will be very difficult when you start up, and it will take a while before your characters grow into the task they're supposed to perform eventually. So make sure to save often and keep few of those saves running. You know, just in case. Other than the combat, you'll naturally have to tackle tons of different puzzles of various difficulty, some logic-based and others purely environmental. All fun though. And you also have to remember about resting, feeding and watering of your duo of heroes so that they would stay alive. Graphics and sounds are rather good, even if not spectacular, but the true highlight of the Crystal Dragon is the gameplay, which after you get used to it and bulk up your party a little, will be hella fun. I mean, in what other game could you use a dead rat as a weapon? Bolo Mrówkojad, which is actually pronounced Bolo Mrówkojad, is a Polish side-scrolling platformer. You play as an anteater and have to complete 5 increasingly difficult stages, avoiding various creatures and different obstacles. Touching any of these causes you to lose a life and returns you to the last checkpoint. That said, Bolo Mrówkojad is a very simple, basic even game, where there's no weapons, no power-ups or pickups, and all you have to do is to get to the end of each stage, timing your jumps properly and avoiding bodies carefully. Nothing more, nothing less. The graphics are nice and colorful, the animation is smooth, and overall the game looks pretty decent. That said, it was also released in 1997, long after Amiga officially ceased to exist, and it only ever came out in Polish. It's a platformer though, and one that does not require learning any complicated mechanics, gameplay concepts, or even background story, so not having any knowledge of the language should not really be a factor in deciding if you should play it or not. I feel that it's really decent for what it is, even if not necessarily for me being as simple as it is design-wise, and too little too late to have any real impact on Amiga's gaming scene. Dragon Fighter is an interesting, though unspectacular, horizontally scrolling fantasy-themed shoot-'em-up, in which you fly on the back of the dragon like you would have rode a pony, exploring 5 different areas, completing dozens of levels and visiting towns between them. Why do you do that? Well, for one, because you can, and that's as good reason as any, and for two, because apparently if you complete all stages and free the land of all the bodies, you will become the new king. And who wouldn't want to be a king? Well, me. I wouldn't, at least not then and there, but that's a story for another time. And there's plenty reasons not to be one, trust me. There's the toilets, or lack thereof really, high cholesterol, fatty and unhygienically prepared food, arranged marriages, death from a rusty nail, and, well, a dragon. And that's just scratching the surface. So, you fly through the stages fighting various interestingly designed enemies, and depending on how many you annihilate, you are giving a monetary compensation after level completion. The money can be spent in towns on upgrades to your weapon, which may sound odd when talking about the dragon that breathes fire, but it is what it is. Perhaps it's extra sulfur that you're buying, or oil, I don't know. Important thing is that it works. And you can also get extra speed and life energy so that you would be more resistant to damage. And since there's no lives in Dragon Fighter and you only have one, same as in real life, it's worth to keep that energy at reasonably high level. Other than that, there's only dice gambling in taverns in towns, and it can as easily multiply your spending budget as it can shrink it, even down to 0. So, approach it only when in the most dire of needs. That said, if I'm to be honest, the gambling bit is totally unnecessary. Not because it's gambling, I have no problem with that, but because it literally is not necessary. It adds nothing and is nothing special whatsoever. The more you play Dragon Fighter, the sooner you realize that other than the towns arranged in a diamond-shaped map and dragon riding gimmick, there's not much there elevating the game over dozens of other shooters on the Amiga. Sure, it looks and sounds decent, even if nothing out of ordinary, but even that, along with average at best gameplay, does not make Dragon Fighter any better than the competition. And that's why, if I'm to be honest, I'd wager a guess that not many played it or even knew of it either. The City of Death, aka Miasto Śmierci in its original Polish, is an obscure late 1996 sci-fi action shooter. And while it's not spectacular in any way imaginable, it's not an absolute stinker as many other of those very late low-budget games were. A mad scientist wants to take over the world, so given the quality of the gaming subject, I'd call him, let's say, a budget Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor, with OR missing because of the lack of finance. And you're the secret agent who's given literally no choice but to jump behind the remote controls of a modern bipedal battle robot called Moa and stop him. Preferably in that particular order. Moa is armed with 5 different weapons. No. I think I got it wrong. Let me start again. Moa is armed with 5 identical weapons, only distinguishable between each other with the sound that they make and perceivable power. Yes, that sounds way better. The gameplay takes place on 2 separate planes. First is quote-unquote overworld labyrinth-like map of the titular city, where you move between different sectors. It's also where, with a bit of luck, you may find ammo for weapons other than the most basic one, which has unlimited supply of it. Then there are the battle screens to which the game switches whenever there's enemy force in one of the aforementioned sectors and combat begins. These are usually pretty detailed, depicting blocks of apartments in various stages of degradation and generally speaking don't look bad other than using very limited yellow-brownish palette for whatever the reason. This is where you face the enemies Operation Wolf style, and despite being a very simplified version of the classic, those combat bits are actually kinda enjoyable, for what they are, that is. So you shoot tons of bodies there, some of them are exploding in fiery blaze cause they're cyborgs, while others, well, there's no other way going around it, also explode but in pools of blood, cause they're humans, I think. Perhaps androids. I didn't look too deep into the game's near non-existent lore. To complete the stage/zone, you have to kill a certain number of enemies, and when you do, the game comes back to the overhead map, regardless if there were any enemies left on the screen or not, which is at the very least odd, but whatever. So, not to waste any more of your time, that's pretty much it. Nothing more to this little game. If you liked Operation Wolf or Cabal, you can check it out, there's a chance you'll find it in yourself to complete it, but if you didn't, there's not much here else for you. Missiles over Xerion is a very modern, for its time at least, missile command clone. It's not just a straight-up copy though, but an expansion of the original idea, which while being heavily built upon, is still true to the original game's roots. Same as in the arcade classic, the aliens are attacking. This time, however, it's not Earth, but city of Xerion on one of our colonies. And said attack is more than effective. It is estimated that in one sweep wave, all but 2,000 of citizens have been wiped out. Given the enemy's overwhelming forces and the fact that you're busy saving the world somewhere, in some other game most likely, perhaps even alien target that we spoke about today, all we can do is defend ourselves. But perhaps, if we manage to do it efficiently enough, we'll be able to repel the alien scum forces. We'll see. Unlike in the original, Xerion does not see us defending multiple cities, but only the titular one. Which is not a surprise, as you're not here and despite how hard we try, we can never measure up to your skill level. And one is pretty much all we can protect without your help. That said, given the seriousness of the situation and your absence, we are given a chance to arm the city with various stronger and deadlier weapons, like heavy metal or even nuclear missiles, different types of bombs, or even get an energy storage expansion or faster recharge of it for the city. Which may sound cryptic, but in the simplest of terms explainable, means fuel for the force field protecting the city. Because yes, there is one too. Interestingly enough, Xerion is not attacked with missiles only, but by various types of projectiles, bombs, or even by the enemies directly arriving in deadly waves. All that makes for a very fun and fresh-feeling take on the classic. And coupled with stellar presentation, it's a very enjoyable and action-packed game which no doubt will provide hours of fun to all fans of the original. Why only them and not everyone though? Cause by 1994, and even more so today, in 2024, missile command formula feels very dated. And even in rehashed, upgraded form as it is served in Xerion, under all of its improvements, holds the same general gameplay idea which may not be as popular so many years later anymore. I think it's fine, you know, but I've played the original in arcades too, so I have a lot of sentiment to its formula. But not everyone is me. And even I can't play it longer than 2-3 games at a time, before feeling of unease and repetition sets in, heavily impacting the fun factor. While I always considered its successor to be much better game, Skidmarks is pretty good on its own too. It's an isometric top-down view racer for up to 4 players and it offers selection of 4 cars. But to be able to have them all on the screen at once, you need a system with at least 2.5 MB of RAM. Otherwise, whatever you choose, everyone will use, player or computer alike, and there'll be no variety in vehicles other than the color. Which is a bit disappointing, but I suppose there had to be some kind of hardware limitations that required the additional memory to load all the assets. Or perhaps there was no compression routines, or maybe even the programming language of choice, Blitz Basic, is the culprit here. It's hard to tell now years later, being nothing more than a former player of the game. But these are my best guesses, at least for the time being. Anyway, all 12 tracks are circuits with no sprint races available, but they're quite fun to race on and reward mastering drifting. The corners are often sharp and devilishly difficult to take perfectly, and the jumps on some of them add to the randomness of gameplay and fun. If you play against others, that is, and not the CPU, that seems to be all over the place skill-wise. But more often than not, on the easier side. Graphically, the game looks okay, some would probably swear that it was amazing, but it never struck me as such. And it definitely looked better 2 years later in the form of Super Skidmarks, even if marginally better only. But it's worth noting that each car is made up of 800 sprites, which is 32 rotations with 5 pitches and elevations. And come to think of it, this may be the reason for the memory requirement of it. Who would have thought that when I came here to talk about the game, I would have also solved an old and time-forgotten mystery? What a day. If you have someone with you and all of you like top-down racers, it's definitely not one to skip. Given how many of those late Amiga releases, especially in the FPS genre, came from Poland, for a long while I was under the impression that Testament, today's gaming subject, was Polish too. While in fact it was developed by Insanity, later known as Bohemia Interactive, a Slovakia-based studio that was eventually incorporated into THQ. But that's a story for another video. Still, Testament is a very late Amiga FPS running on Insanity's in-house engine, which was surprisingly well put together and allowed for a pretty comfortable full-screen gameplay even on an unexpanded A1200. Sure, it benefited heavily from any and all upgrades you could throw at it, but even without them, it played smoother in full screen than virtually anything else in the genre at the time did. And all that with textured walls, floors and ceilings. Quite the achievement if you ask me. That said, in 1997 it was too little too late, and honestly, other than the 7 remaining hardcore fans in the wild somewhere, still squeezing the last juices from on-life support by the Amiga, no one saw the game. I'm obviously exaggerating, especially that there was a sequel to it released a year later, but however you want to look at it, it was brave of Insanity to release games on Amiga by 1997 and 1998. Anyway, as you're on an expedition to uncover the crypt of ancient Magus Gupta, one of the most powerful sorcerers of the yore and the ruler of the entire empire from 4000 years before, you are separated from your group. And as soon as you are, the monstrosities arise and begin doing whatever's possible to kill you. Since you were an armed guard of the expedition, however, you are more than prepared to defend yourself. But are you prepared for the horror-like creatures and even confrontation with the evil Magus himself? Time will tell, if you decide to give Testament a go and complete it. Testament is a horror and macabre-themed first-person shooter set inside and outside of various catacombs, graveyards and dungeons, filled with many different nightmare-inducing monsters. And in that, it's more similar to Doom than any other sci-fi or war-themed FPSs of the time. It is composed out of 16 rather large but not too big levels, filled with depth to the brim and some very simple environmental puzzling for good measure too, usually centered around finding appropriate colored keys for the same colored doors. While there is only 4 weapons in Testament, so a gun, machine gun, fireball and so-called double, which for all intents and purposes is just a more powerful fireball. The variety of enemies, fluidity of gameplay, atmosphere and fun factor more than make up for a lack of diverse armament. If that wasn't enough, it is clear from the get-go that a lot of thought went into gameplay design and pacing, as the difficulty curve grows steadily, allowing you to learn everything and grasp the controls ahead of throwing more demanding stuff at you. It's a perfect shooter for a basic A1200, and I don't think that any fan of Amiga and the genre should overlook this late hidden gem. Simply put, Traps and Treasures is fantastic, and you can quote me on that. It may not be as big or as full of secrets and hidden passages as Super Frog, or as compulsive and random as Robocop 2 is, but it doesn't have to be, as it's an entirely different kind of a platformer. It's not a game where you travel through huge multiple screen spawning and 4-way scrolling levels, it's more linear and straightforward. Sure, it scrolls always, but the levels are shorter and more contained. Objective-wise, all you have to do is save your crewmates and get to the end of each level. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, this may sound simple, boring and perhaps repetitive even, but believe me, it's anything but. Traps and Treasures is pretty difficult and requires ninja-like reflexes at times, but it's also incredibly fun and rewarding. On your way, you'll encounter many different pirate and marine-themed enemies and obstacles, all beautifully designed and super smoothly animated. And since we're on the presentation, it's great. The game is colorful and has its own very unique graphical style that I'm not sure I've seen in any other titles. Pretty cool addition to it all is seemingly active or at least smartly scripted music system that switches tracks in very specific situations, for instance when going underwater to a more nautical suiting melody. The swashbuckling piratey atmosphere is spilling through the screen when playing Traps and Treasures, and for the life of me, I cannot fathom a guess why Traps and Treasures didn't get a wider recognition and popularity. Maybe because it wasn't as well known outside its country of origin or had a limited advertising. Or maybe it was something else. In the end, it was just not in the cards for it. Despite that, it's definitely one of the best platformers on the Amiga and a game I enjoy coming back to, even if only to fail couple levels in. How did you like today's selection? Some games we've covered in previous Amiga-centric series, but many were entirely new, and all are worth remembering. So, let me know what you think of them in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit those like and subscribe buttons below. Smash them if you have to, it helps more than you could ever know. Also, I would like to thank you and all my amazing Patreon and YouTube members for helping this channel keep going. And last but definitely not least, I would like to thank all the wonderful folks who record and upload playthroughs, let's plays and other retro-centric videos here on YouTube, because they help to preserve the games that would have otherwise been long forgotten. So thank you.